Yes, I have. Can I be heard? Can you hear me? All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. You yes, in this part, some distinguished at the very first or at the very beginning of as well as the second administration, Professor Gumede, and Mr. Jeff Peires, who is the discussion is because it discusses legacy. The legacies are important juncture of our historical existence in Africa. We have learned from the presentations, the keynote addresses that have the demise of the neoliberal foundations that we thought were going to sustain. They are being challenged at the moment. But also, what grand socialism would have looked like. So I'm having the task channel, but to try and give these matters in context, those that affect us here in Africa, and having been where we are, and the screen will share. I'm sitting now at the moment, and when we started government, then we didn't anticipate load sharing, and perhaps the question that is in front of us is not only the question for South Africa, but the question for governance and in Africa. And of course, we know that since the 1980s, several countries embarked on reforms following World Bank stabilization, the Washington Consensus, the IMF structural adjustment programs, and of course the MDGs that came from there. But in spite of these reforms, inclusive growth has been very elusive in Africa. And of many times, weak institutions. And from time to time, as South Africa, we have been trying to say, let's fix this, fix that, looking at the microeconomic reforms. And then through Donaldson at the Treasury was largely at the center of this, when myself was at the center of providing the numbers that provided the evidence of whether or not they are succeeding. And Professor Vusi Gumede was looking at the macro social organization of the state. I want to start off by just comparing 2008 here, which is the light blue on unemployment on the left, and the light green on the right on the employed. And an interesting feature here is that over this period from 2008, which is the light blue, light green this side, 2008 Q3, looking at those who were 25 to 34, their share of employment was almost equivalent to that of those who are 35 to 44, certainly higher than those who are 45 to 54. And those who were 15 to 24 were also having a share, but by 2018 we see that that share had actually reduced, and for those who are 25 to 34, it had shrunk. Something has happened by the first quarter of 2022. We find that this happened already, or the fires or anything, or the floods, but this had been dramatically increasing since 2020 to where it is now, that the youth 25 to 34 lost their 2017, we see a similar pattern for blacks, but a dramatically different pattern for white and Indians. And by 2020, we see again stagnation amongst blacks and a much more progress amongst or retention of privilege amongst Indian and white, whereas amongst colors and blacks, things have been stagnant. Now, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, are the policies that we adopted, Andrew, and that Gumede, appropriate, that we have appropriated for ourselves since 1994? Of course, here, the last 24 quarters, we see stagnation on gross capital formation declining there. We see the same for GDP. This is the fourth quarter of 2021. And we see that the GDP only inched to pre-COVID levels in the fourth quarter of this year. And of course, our policies do show that the National Treasury and Presidency, the targets that they have going forward, are actually showing a very deleterious economic performance. 1.6% growth, 37% unemployment, is beaten by the targets that Business for South Africa was proposing to government, and it's also beaten by the modeling performance that we said if we followed the 6-pillar policy, and by what Gauteng proposed for itself. So where are we headed? Let me start with you, Andrew, and then Gumede, you can come in. And so let's start with you, Andrew. I've just given the trajectory up to now. In retrospect and projecting forward, what would you say about this performance? Are we doing more, or are we proposing more of the same? Or is the proposal on the table going to resolve the problems? Thanks.
Our structure and architecture of government is going to have to become simpler, is going to have to be more functional, to use an architectural metaphor, and is going to have to involve some simpler styles of doing business. So I'm arguing really that there are unintended consequences of the institutional modernization which we've undertaken as part of the transformation of the state over the last 20 years. There's a general, very simple thesis behind this, which is that we've expanded our institutional superstructures of oversight, of regulatory systems and apparatus, rules of the game, checks and balances, in beyond the capacity to staff these functions, these institutions adequately, and in ways which are dysfunctional and self-defeating. In effect, we've created, in some respects, an architecture of the state that is destroying itself. And I'm going to give some illustrations of that. So we've built regulatory and governance arrangements without being able to staff them or to manage the transitions from former arrangements to new arrangements adequately, and so they've not yielded the intended benefits. And we can think of this in the regulatory environments in several areas. I'm sure everybody listening will have immediately some sense of the sectors that you're familiar with, in which new governance and institutions, new regulatory arrangements that have had disappointing and in some respects counterproductive effects. But it's
noise coming from there as you work through your papers. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to listen. I'm going to put this. That will help. Are you able to hear me better now?
Yes, we can, but there is a background noise. But yes, I can hear you. But there's background noise, or probably it actually comes from you rather than from.
I'm going to carry on. I hope that's better.
Yes, continue.
All right, fine. So the institutional arrangements we've put in place have not yielded what they promised, but they've also starved the implementation capabilities of government and more broadly the implementation capabilities of the economy in ways that have held back growth. And in some respects, I'm making a very simple point here about skills. And Paddy, you showed the picture of the shifts in demand, quite substantial shifts in demand for professional and skilled occupations, but we've struggled to meet those demands. Expansion of governance institutions has contributed to that demand, and the outcomes have been both weak institutions and a drain of expertise and resources in the wider economy. And of course, these reforms have also, in important ways, raised the cost of doing business, and that's become a barrier to progress of the wider economy. There are some complex and interesting issues here about the longer historical legacy of institutions and how they've evolved over time. I'm not going to talk very much about that, except to say that there really are very, very long colonial legacies in our institutions of governance, in the arrangements we have in place, pension systems for public administration, and they have been disrupted over the last 20 years in ways that in some respects have had positive consequences, but in others have been disruptive. So when you raise the costs of doing business legitimately in an economy, when you make the business of governments, the tasks that officials and ministers are responsible for, complex mix of mandates, when you make the job of doing business and the tasks of government difficult to undertake legitimately, you have to expect there'll be a rise in illegitimate manifestations, both in the public and private sectors. And I think that's an important sense of what we've seen in the last decade or so. Now, this thesis can be applied in any number of sectors or spheres of activity. I really just want to give some examples. And we're not just talking about skills constraints here, we're also talking about the rise of contestation around policy between ministries, departments, regulators, different departments with overlapping responsibilities, and the contribution of that to policy uncertainty, or to put that positively, the increasing complexity of building coherent policy frameworks. I'm going to just say a few things about a few examples in public finance management, sector regulation and planning. We can also look at how this is played out in environmental standards and overlapping challenges and responsibilities of different departments and regulators. The enormously important area of urban and rural planning and municipal governance, and I'll say a bit about that, where we have a picture in our minds of a great deal of dysfunctionality, but in some ways that dysfunctionality, it seems to me, has to be explained by the architecture and the modernization project, the architecture of the local government system and the modernization projects that we've undertaken. Think about justice system, probably won't get time to say very much about that, but I think we all are familiar with how overladen our justice system is, longer and longer courts backlogs, in part because we have set such high standards of the processes that we expect of our justice system, the range of issues, both civil and criminal, that they're obliged to deal with, and if administrative law, criminal prosecution systems, if civil procedures cannot be implemented efficiently, then the backlogs become steeper, deeper, and the system becomes more self-defeating. In our financial sector, extraordinarily high demands and standards that we set in financial regulation, one can tell similar stories about. In public financial management, we set out to modernize public financial management in the 1990s, and there's already been reference to that, I think, in the interesting remarks that Pratap made. I remember Alan Schick, one of the great international advisors on public finance management, cautioning in the 1990s that some of the kinds of modernization of public finance and management that we were contemplating were too ambitious, would result in excess demands on organs of state, and indeed that's the way it worked out. Immensely challenging administrative procedures, an overload of reporting and planning requirements, the complexities of a budget process tied to planning systems and reporting systems that have become an immense burden on organs of state, and that in many respects have become self-defeating. We need to find ways of simplifying these things, reporting systems. And in respect of audit and investigation, we not only have built an internationally impressive Auditor General's Office, but we've also phased in a huge system of internal audit that didn't exist 30 years ago in government, that has itself taken up a great deal of financial management capacity. I say to myself sometimes, looking at the overall structure of employment in public financial management in our economy, that we have far too many people involved in audit and inspection and oversight relative to those who are actually doing the job of implementing departmental programs and policies, and an increasing breakdown of trust between managers and the auditors and investigators who are looking into what they do. And in procurement, I'm sure I don't need to say very much about it. The example we've had just in the last few weeks of a major state entity cancelling 27 billion rands worth of tenders because it wanted to change the way in which the tender processes and large contract management were being managed, is symptomatic of that clash of governance, oversight, standards, reform, if you like, clash of those oversight arrangements with the business of getting on with government. And in the infrastructure area, the Sanral case that I'm talking about now, the cost is really, really large. We have huge backlogs in infrastructure. For 20 years, we've been talking about accelerating the pace of infrastructure delivery, of investment, improved maintenance required, particularly at local government level, and we are going backwards there. We are not making progress. The proportion of spending on GDP and the proportion of budgets that are spent on infrastructure management is way below what is needed. In sectoral policies, we've established new and institutionally complex regulatory frameworks: telecoms, energy, competition policy, consumer protection, financial services, in education and health, etc. And we have increasingly challenging environmental standards to which organs of state and businesses are obliged to apply. There are costs to all of these. They slow down activity in important respects. But if then unable to deliver the services, manage the regulatory changes, think telecoms, in ways that contribute to growth and development, they're counterproductive. But behind this is that there's this argument about the impact on the economy is, of course, that there is that there are spillover effects, there are externalities from all of these areas of reform. In themselves, these are mainly desirable reform directions in which one wants to go. Sector by sector, we're trying to do the modernizations that we need to take them all together, and they add up to an overload, an excess of demand on the resources needed to manage the modernization project well, but an overload also on the performance of the economy. So the sum of the whole is more damaging than the individual parts. And I perhaps should just finish off by making a few specific points about the local government and the urban planning environment, because here I think we have overlapping modernization projects that interact with each other in ways that have been particularly dysfunctional. We changed the overall architecture of the local government environment in ways in which we've created a great deal of complexity, overlapping jurisdictions between local and district municipalities. In many parts of the country, overlaps between the official local and district municipalities and traditional authorities, who also play an important part in development approvals and program management. Complex, but revenue and mandate, divisions of responsibility between local and district councils, and an impact on that on service delivery and coherence of policy that we can see across the country in many ways. This has coincided with one of the most ambitious modernizations of accounting and financial management systems for local government implemented anywhere in the world. There are few countries that have actually tried to do the full transition to modern accounting standards in the local government environment, movement from cash-based accounts to accrual-based accounts, and all the reporting and standardization that goes with that. An immense burden on administrations that are weak in the first place, and apart from larger cities, are still struggling with the transition to new standards that have been set by the Treasury. Much of this has had a consequence that has reinforced a colonial legacy in the local government and community development environment of disempowerment of local decision-making and over-centralization of standards and requirements. And you disempower local decision-making, things go wrong, and you disempower them further with even greater regulatory interventions and intrusion. And it becomes a kind of a spiral of over-centralization, increasing dysfunctionality, and a reinforcement of what seems to me a incentive incompatible set of arrangements around the local business of investment, property development, and building viable communities delivering services. And a critical failure associated with this dysfunctionality in the architecture of local government is that there is such a preoccupation with short-term reporting and standards and accountability at the expense of the focus on the long term that is needed. Municipalities are, especially of the three spheres of government, obliged to think long term. They have to invest in infrastructure and capacity for the long term future. They have to think about their growth, how they meet rising residential needs, population movement, business development, and the inability to plan for and the constraints on accessing finance in capital markets, accessing finance in ways that can underpin longer-term investment and longer-term growth, and in some respects, constraints on the ability to act entrepreneurially as local authorities. All of these hold back growth and development and reinforce that sort of spiral of slow growth and rising service challenges that, Paddy, you talked about in introduction, in introducing this issue. It's not that our municipalities have lost their sources of revenue. In fact, revenue has remained quite buoyant across the board. It's not that our municipalities are in debt. There are imbalances and mismatches between different parts of the municipal system. There is debt that is owed by households that are unable to pay. It's still written up as revenue, but it's never going to be collected. It should not be written up as revenue. We should not be trying to modernize the accounts in that sense. Operating on a cash system would make the finances of municipalities much clearer and far more transparent. There systems that need to be reformed and changed here, I'm raising question marks about the modernization project in local government. But of course, that isn't to say that everything that has been undertaken as part of the reform initiative needs to be abandoned. And then lastly, just quickly, in the financial oversight sector, Twin Peaks is expensive. The new regulators are really large and costly. The Reserve Bank is a much larger, much better resourced facility than it was, institution than it was 30 years ago. The Public Investment Corporation overseeing management of the pension funds arrangements of government is a much larger institution, much more costly than it was when it was a chief directorate within the Department of Finance in the 1990s. The GEPF itself is a much larger and stronger institution than it was. And that's all part of a large burden of costs in the financial sector. And as those who track performance of the economy know, this is a sector that has grown fast. The rest of the economy is not following. There is a financialization problem here. It's not easy to sort out the productive from the unproductive activities in the financial sector. And so a considerable amount of work needs to be done to get these reforms and oversights right. There are the benefits of lower risks, but there's the cost of the burden and expertise drain on the overall economy that this kind of modernization leads to. I think I've probably said enough to make the points that I want to. And Paddy, let me hand back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andrew. I was load shed at some point of your discussion as 2 o'clock triggered, and then I had to switch on to another source of power. I didn't say who you are, but now that you have spoken, I should say who you are or who you were and who you are now. Eddie Donaldson is an economist and senior research associate of the Southern Africa Labour and Development Research Unit, SALDRU, at the University of Cape Town. He's a former head of the Budget Office and the Public Finance Division of the National Treasury and serves as the inaugural head of the Government Technical Advisory Center. Andrew is a graduate of Stellenbosch University, UNISA, and Cambridge University. Thank you very much for your presentation. And well, I think during the discussion that we'll have, we would like to hear what is your crystal ball for the future, given where we were, where we are now, or are we treading the same path continuously? Now, I would pass the baton from you, Andrew, I'll jump to Professor Gumede. He worked for the South African government in various capacities and in different departments for 11 years. He has been an academic for 12 years. He has held various professorships, fellowships, and editorships in and outside South Africa. He's currently a dean for the Faculty of Economics, Development and Business Sciences at the University of Mpumalanga in South Africa. He holds a PhD in economics, which he completed in 2003 at the University of Natal. Just like Andrew, they have a very elaborate CV. I'll leave it there. Over to you, Professor Gumede. What has happened to a project of the macro social organization of the state? Macro, yes.
Greetings, hello, panel members and new chair. It's good to be together and brainstorm jointly again, as we did those many years back in government. And thanks for the opportunity to the organizers. I've been doing this work slowly to try and answer the question of what is the real challenge that we face with our government. Is it the capacity or shortage thereof, or some other issue, or is it the manner in which we are organized? In other words, the institutional architecture of the government. So I'm going to share some few views, some views around that, some few points around that from what I've been doing, and I've written a book that should be hitting the shelves hopefully in the next 3 months or so, trying to deal with those issues in a comparative context. You recall Dr. Lehohla and probably Andrew Donaldson also remember this. In 2004, former President Thabo Mbeki wrote that note that he had titled "The Capacity and Organization of the State," which he sent to the ministers and asking a question whether or was government appropriately organized for the goals that we need to achieve, dealing with poverty, for instance, which was one of the preoccupations then, growing the economy, and cutting poverty to half, those preoccupations of point in time, dealing with unemployment, inequality, and so forth. So the question is old, in a sense. Yes.
Just a second. I think we may allow you to speak and not see you. Okay. It will be fine, because I think your line might just be suffering when you speak.
Yes, I'm using,
I'm
using my own device here. We're load shedded in the current moment. Okay.
Yes.
No, thanks for that. Yes. So I just indicated that there's this short paper that former President Thabo Mbeki had written in 2004, asking a question whether the government was capacitated, organized properly for the goal that need to be achieved, for the goals that need to be achieved. And we know all of them at that point in time is, halving poverty and unemployment and so forth. And that initiative, as you recall, led to new capacities that were introduced in government, particularly monitoring and evaluation and long-term planning, and later on, of course, the reorganization of the planning and monitoring functions in government. Initially, M&E and long-term planning was introduced in the policy unit where we were, and from around 2009 to about 2012, new ministries were created, new departments were created, and of course, the National Planning Commission was inaugurated. So this I think is important when we look into this issue. And however, the second point, as part of this background, I just saw a note from Ivor here. I have a challenge of my with the bandwidth. That's why I've switched off the video. Is that development outcomes, whichever way you look at them, if you think about well-being broadly, it has been deteriorating. If you think in terms of per capita incomes, for instance, if you think about access to services, we know about unemployment, we know about poverty. All these challenges, in a sense, have become more pronounced. Although we've been having these initiatives to improve how government is capacitated and how government is organized. You could look at this, for instance, in terms of the headcount within government, the increase in the numbers of the people that are employed, or look at it, through compensation expenditure, share of GDP or share of total expenditure. You can look at this as I've done the numbers of public servants, 100 people. We know, for instance, with departments that in the first administration, 27 departments, and now we've got 39 government departments. In the fifth administration, we shot 47, I think, or 45 government departments, and of course, the number of ministries, ministers and deputy ministers have increased significantly since the first administration. And that, of course, has got implications for also the number of people that are working in government. If you look at it in terms of the compensation expenditure as a share of total expenditure, South Africa is much higher. Its share is much higher compared to Malaysia, for instance, that I've looked at more closely, Brazil, Botswana around the corner here, Singapore, and other countries, even the so-called developed countries. Our share of compensation expenditure is a share of total expenditure. If you compare with UK or US, much higher, and much higher, of course, than China. And the numbers for public servants per 100 people for South Africa is 5, Brazil just around 5, Malaysia, Botswana, and the US, if you take one country, so-called developed country, the number is 6. So in a sense, in terms of capacity, I think there may be questions whether we really have a challenge of capacity in government, at least in terms of the head count, public servants per 100 people, which therefore raises issues that where the problem could be. It may very well be that we don't have the right people in the right places. This could be, one of the issues. If you look at the data for productivity in the public sector, other numbers that have, crunched, suggest that for many government departments, productivity has been declining, and for many of them, it has not improved over time. Another piece of information as background, if you think about capacity, we know that there have been many capacity building initiatives in government, including training programs through, for instance, SAMDI, Palama, and now the National School of Government. And we know that South Africa has aspired to be a developmental state. This has been going on since the 2000s or mid-2000s. And of course, in 2007, this was indicated publicly that South Africa aspires to be a democratic developmental state. Think about the history a bit here is that the apartheid state is also said to have been a developmental state, although of course for the minority, and whether what we are doing as a country, the manner in which government is organized, digital architecture, and capacity and related factors are taking us anywhere closer to becoming a developmental state. So the two last points I want to make, in a sense, rhetorical questions that I try and answer is, one, whether the planning and coordination functions in government, whether these are properly established and whether are they effectively implemented. So we know there's large number of people who work on long-term planning, and now we've got a unit that deals with coordination in the presence, just like the police unit during our time when we're there. We know about the National Planning Commission, and the question perhaps around that is whether the National Planning Commission has the right people in it, and secondly, whether it's appropriately structured and its proximity relationship with the government. And lastly, we know that there are these many advisory councils in government. Some of us are part of these advisory councils of the president and ministers. And of course, we input in various ways. So is there a constraint that the Constitution imposes in the reconfiguration of government? I think the straight answer is no. I'm trying to get our theme here. That essentially our challenge, or South Africa's challenge, has to do with the institutional architecture, at least from my research, and I think what Andrew Donaldson is saying, may support this. So we need to ensure that there's effective planning, there's effective coordination, and sound implementation of programs and policies, and that means perhaps we need to look about, think about how we reconfigure the digital architecture of the government. The countries that I've looked at, say, for instance, Malaysia, Brazil, Mauritius, and many others, seem to have more capacity. Singapore, I shouldn't forget to mention that, seem to have more capacity that's placed at the center of government. So there's more technical capacity that you find in government and also in the planning commissions of these various countries. And I think it matters what kind of capacity that the government has at different levels. Of course, at local government level, as I was saying, there may be different kind of we must be in a position. I mean, do we have people in government who understand the issues that Andrew Donaldson, for instance, is talking about, and who think about the solutions to those issues? That's what I mean by thought leadership in a simplistic form. And I think I could stop here. If we're able to address some of these issues and configure the manner in which we're organized as a state, maybe we're able to address what seems to be downward spiral, Dr. Lehohla, that you've shown us when you were starting off. Thanks, Chair.
Very much, Professor Gumede, and thanks so much about walking us along the memory lane, just as Andrew had. The third speaker we have here is Mr. Jeff Peires, who was a member of the Transkei Regional Executive of the ENC between 1990 and 1994, after which he represented Ngobo in the National Assembly from 1994 to 1996. He was redeployed to the Eastern Cape government, where he served in various capacities, including special development programs, Office of the Premier, and acting head of Department of Economic Affairs, Environment and Tourism, and he left government in 2006. He left before trouble started. Do you have any regrets? And what can you do with this? Over to you, sir.
Yes, I have many regrets, more for our country than for myself, let me say. But thank you, Chairperson, also for the opportunity. Let me first begin by, in fact, Chairperson has given it away. I came to the National Assembly as a nominee of the Transkei region of the African National Congress from the so-called independent homeland of Transkei, as it was then called. And when I was in Cape Town, I was on various portfolio committees where there were also representatives of the other homelands, the so-called homelands. So I think I got from this a fairly clear idea of what the real grassroots communities were looking for. And I also got a fairly clear idea of what was on offer from the state. Of course, at that point, represented largely by people from the old order. In any case, I remained there until the passing of our new constitution, said to be the best constitution in the world. And what I'd like to talk about is the collision between the expectations of the residents of the former homelands and what actually transpired in terms of the architecture of government. I think it's fair to characterize the homeland system as revolving around a big man with a big bag. And the expectation of the big man, in the case of Transkei, KD Matanzima, was that the ordinary people should come and submit humbly, Konza, knock their heads on the floor, and then he would put his hand in the big bag and give them whatever he was going to give them. That is the way the homeland system worked. And when we were looking forward to freedom, what we thought was that, number one, the big bag would be much bigger and the resources would be equitably shared, not according to the whims and personal preferences of the big man. And when we visualized the big bag in those days, it was in the colors of what we used to call the OMO document of the Reconstruction and Development Program. And that's what we expected. But when we got to the National Assembly, in our portfolio committees, we found something rather different. what happened was a whole procession of old order bureaucrats and administrators. They came in cowering and trembling, let me say, and they tried to, in all honesty, explain what they were doing in terms of budgeting. And this is really what I want to talk about mostly, is the budget process. And I remember from those exchanges in the portfolio committee, particularly two comments that were made by lady comrades, the one from Gazankulu homeland, second one from Kangwane, I think. And the one said she lost her temper with the people, the administrators. She said, "You keep on telling us about the problems. We don't want to hear about the problems. You are paid to solve these problems. We want you to come with solutions." And I remember thinking that this particular comrade is not quite where she should be. The second intervention was to say, people, you're doing this the wrong way around. You're telling us how much money there is and how I should spend the money. You are wasting your time. What you should be doing is going around the areas, looking at the needs, and then once you've tabulated all the needs, then come back and divide the money accordingly. Now, that also seemed to me to be naive in the extreme. But looking back on the way things were done in the old Transkei homeland, there were two things I'm going to lift. The one is that every year, a little team from the homeland government would go to Pretoria and they would sit with, there was a special division of Pip Botha's office. Remember, we were an independent country, so we were managed by the Department of Foreign Affairs. And there was a special department that looked after us. And they sat there for about 2 months. And they had a list of every school, every clinic, every road in the entire homeland. And they went through it line item by line item, costing, arguing, saying, this is all we've got, no, we need more, and so on, until eventually the Transkei representatives returned, disappointed, with a clear idea of what money was available and where that money was going. The second thing, a positive about the old Transkei homeland, is we had a department of rural engineering. This department built dipping tanks, stocked dams, fixed up all the roads to the best of its ability, sorted out the water problems to the best of its ability. It was run by two, we used to call them Baha'is. I think they were originally from Iran, the Shaka brothers. And they had in their office a complete map of the entire homeland, showing exactly what was being funded, what was not being funded, and so forth. And this now, looking back on it, that was not such a stupid idea after all. With a huge amount of data, the improvement in data collection, the coming of geographic information systems, it should be technically possible to actually tabulate the needs and the priorities. So I think that was really, we should really be looking at starting with the needs and then coming up with a budget. Because of course what wrecked the RDP, we all thought this was going to be a big bag, but it wasn't. It was rather a lot of pieces. the different departments hung on to their money. And so each department was supposed to reconfigure its department allocation in terms of the needs of the RDP, which of course it didn't do. So my first historically based comment is that one should really be looking at some sort of comprehensive database which would enable us to align the needs with the money, rather than starting off with the money in the line items and trying to match it with the facts on the ground. The second comment I would like to make relates to the chain of authority. When I was working in Bisho, my office window looked out over the lawn in front of the office of the Premier. And every day we'd see literally hundreds of people from the most rural areas who had come from the most remote places to plead their case with the Premier. We have a problem, and expecting the Premier to solve the problem. And it was embarrassing to watch the Premier explaining to the people who are suffering from, for example, stock theft, I'm terribly sorry, but we have no control over the police. And they say, but you've got a Department of Safety and Liaison. Yes, but I don't have control over the police. Same thing, there was a case in the small town of Berkeley East where the water quality was such that children were dying. And again, the people of Berkeley East came to the Premier and said, Premier, do something. Children are dying. And she says, well, the bulk water supplies with the national government. The reticulation is with the municipality. The water quality control is with the provincial office of the national department. And people go away frustrated and disappointed because they did not like the big man with the big bag, but at least they understood the system. They could work the system. Instead, people are pushed from one side to the other side, and they just don't know what to do. And what actually happens, I appreciated Andrew Donaldson's comments about the visit of the auditors, because we had more people auditing us than we had to do the work that they were auditing. And there is in government what I call also Andrew's comments about the PFMA. It wasn't workable. So what actually happens is that the people that are actually trying to do the work are confronted by what I call the low fence. They're not able to do their work. Whereas the people in the political champions, they see the low fence, they say to hell with it, and they jump over. So there is no coordination. There is no single chain of command. And I know there's been a lot of speculation about that we need to do away with the provinces. I don't think that would be either necessary or good. I think the people on the ground, at least in a province like the Eastern Cape, where there's still one majority party, and I think in spite of other comments, that will continue to be so for the foreseeable future. And they look up to the Premier. The President is someone that is too distant. The Premier is somebody you can talk to. But what you have to do away with, in my opinion, is the things that go with the Constitution. The idea that there are such things as competences. National is competent at that, province is competent for that. Then here again, there are joint competences. I remember I was talking to a colleague of mine. She had worked for the provincial government now she was working at the national level. And there was something that I had a project, and I was looking for money for her, and she had another project that she got at national level, and I knew this project was going to work. And I said, Nosipo, what about cooperational governance? And she said, cooperational governance means that my money is my money and your money is your money. We have to get around this. And with due respect to Andrew, I don't believe the answer is to empower local authorities. People in the deep rural areas are preoccupied with survival. They can't see further than putting food on the table next day or next month. And local authorities as well. And I got tired when I was a regional director. There was a well-intentioned foreign government that was trying to help our province with a notable lack of success. They'll come with a whole bunch of flashcards. Some were red, some were green, some were yellow, some were round, some were square. And they said, now we're going to do a SWOT analysis. What do we want? You know, and people just looked at them in the fifth meeting, they just all went away. I know that the IDP is supposed to cover these issues of coordination. It doesn't work. It's a happy hunting ground for consultants. So in conclusion, my feeling from the experiences that I had and what I observed is that corruption creeps in through the cracks in the system. The fewer the cracks in the system, the less space there is for corruption. So I don't see corruption as the primary problem. I see corruption as something embedded in the best constitution in the world, as I'm constantly told, due to the fact that there's no clear chain of command and there's no rational system of budgeting according to the actual needs which are there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. I see your book here, The Dead Will Arise. How are they going to arise? We are looking at
I think thank you, Chair. I think the dead will arise more easily than this constitution will be made to work. Thank you.
You seem to be very pessimistic. I haven't heard Andrew telling us anything better. Neither have I heard Vusi Gumede telling us anything better. I haven't heard any kindly words for where we are myself. So 4 of us have been in the previous administrations. We have bequeathed this government a particular type of terrain to work with. Probably we bequeathed them the wrong one. How do we participate in bringing a different resolution now that we know where we started, where we left it, and the cracks that are in the system? Do I start with you, Andrew? By the way, I used to be the head of a Homeland Statistics office in Botswana, and we used to actually agree on the allocation of resources from the central government, which was Pretoria, in the same way as you were in the Transkei. But I think for now we need to discuss how do we reconstruct. One of the things, Andrew, that the Treasury rules cost for us at Statistics South Africa was the abolition of the levies, which were part of the source of information. And many of the things that were working were destroyed as we introduced the new, which provided the form of statistics that we required. So we had to resort to other means of review of statistical processes. So that levy, municipal levy, was very important for us for generating the statistics. The removal of marketing boards also made agricultural statistics disappear. So if I were to critique this, my criticism of what we brought about in 1994, at least from a statistician general point of view. But over to you, and to you, Dede Gumede, and of course, finally to Jeff. Andrew.
Well, I think you've made a point. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. So I think you made a good point about decentralized revenue sources. So it's a territory that's difficult to enter. You introduce tolls and they become very unpopular. You expand the municipal estate and try to phase in rates as a source of revenue or service charges, and you've got a lot of homework to do before communities will be comfortable with that. So the alternative revenue issues in governance reform are not easy, but they certainly need to be part of a reform agenda. But I want to speak more broadly about the big economic challenges. So we're, as I said earlier, we're in a period of low investment and low growth that is a consequence of that. We have had low and inadequate investment relative to GDP for 30, 35, maybe 40 years, and we have not succeeded in recovering the momentum of investment and growth since the recession. And it really takes a big push to get that going. And in a sense, that's about a government coordination and leadership issue. Jeff used the image of the big man and the bag of money. The bag might not be very large, but if contestation inhibits the actual implementation of projects, and this is particularly evident in the municipal environment, and the bag doesn't get spent, then even if it isn't very large, the economy is going to be growing more slowly than it otherwise would. We've also clearly in the local government environment, and this is just the last point I'll make, got to recognize considerable diversity. The circumstances of cities, the kinds of greater momentum and independence that the metropolitan authorities and the larger cities need, and in effect the space to take responsibility for their own futures and their own infrastructure needs, whether that's contracting with renewable energy suppliers or building the longer term water and sanitation systems that are needed. That dynamic is a very different one from addressing and fixing the overlapping responsibilities, the absence of capacity, and the high costs of our district and local municipal environment and their relationships with traditional authorities. There, I would put at the top of my reform agenda, growing the urban space. We've imposed these wall-to-wall obligations on local municipalities that, in a sense, has swept away the recognition that what you can do, how you grow local economic activity in the town is different from what is needed and what can be done and what can be financed in providing services across the wider landscape of rural villages and agricultural areas. If we're not growing the commercial centers, if we're not growing the urban landscape, and in the Transkei that Jeff was talking about, the small towns are still effectively being governed in terms of planning environments and decrees that go back nearly a century. And we're not putting the reforms in place, the plans in place that enable towns to grow, the urban space to expand, but to raise its revenue in the ways that a well-managed urban environment does. So I'm going to leave that point on the table, that if we're to overcome our historical legacy of weak planning and infrastructure investment, there's going to have to be some work done on the architecture of local government.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Professor Gumede, can you come in? We've given a historical perspective in our presentations. Now we have to come and say, how do we solve this? And Dr. Donaldson had said these are the things that have to be dealt with. Planning, and looking at the urban space or cities networks as something that can take us from this situation.
Thanks, Chair. Oh, thanks, Chair. Well, there's a lot that needs to be done. It's a complex. It's a complex question. When you think about what needs to be done for our society to get things going. But perhaps limiting myself to what I was talking about around the organization and capacity of the state. Is that perhaps let's at least ensure that there are technical capacities in the right places. So we know areas that are critical, and we need to ensure that there are the right technical capacities in those areas. Number two, I think the point that Andrew Donaldson made around coordination. So I think we do need to improve coordination and capacity to coordinate. I'll add to that planning, particularly long-term planning, monitoring and evaluation, and of course leadership. And I emphasize top leadership, as I said earlier. And just make sure there's productivity. People that are there, do their jobs, do what they're supposed to do, at least. I don't know how you get all of that going, but I do think at least those three areas may help us, take us somewhere. And I don't think, Chair, that the constitution is a constraint to do these things. I don't think the constitution limits the possibility to reorganize government. Even the interface between the national and the provincial and local. I think there are things that we can do, and the question is not necessarily a constraint to that. The question is a problem for other things, but I do not think it's a major issue for these issues, Chair. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Gumede. Mr. Peires, you want to come back and at least give us some hope?
No,
the late Walter Sisulu Stalandwe always said we should give people hope. Give us some hope.
Yes, I can. I know there was an American president that said something like that a while back. Look what happened to him. I think that, and by the way, I understand that this conference is not about crying over spilt milk, but I think that I must say that it was a big mistake for the people of South Africa to rush into globalization as fast as we did. Because there were arguments that I heard. A certain Minister of State had a great capacity for one-line put-downs. He would talk about things like feather bedding, inefficient industries, and so on. And the discourse, I think, of globalization and the discourse of SWOT analysis and ZOP analysis is that everybody has got a competitive advantage somewhere. And I remember the first visit I paid when I was a regional director to the small town of Jamestown which is halfway between Komani and Malatswai. That is Queenstown, used to be the former Queenstown and former Allowell North. And I went there with this idea that people must figure out their competitive advantage. And this was a very small community in which the different racial communities worked very, very well together. And after there were, of course, everybody was hoping I brought something in my bag, but it was only a, copy of a government document. And so after I explained that we must all look for a competitive advantage, and they are the people who know Jamestown and what can work in Jamestown, and the leader of the white community and the leader of the black community went off, and we went off, waited a while they discussed this, and eventually the leader of the black community and said, honestly, Professor, we don't think there's anything that can work in Jamestown. And the whole, I think in geography it's called central place theory, the whole dynamic whereby banks closed down their local branches. In what is now the Chris Hani district, there was a big bank in Komani, but there were little banks in all the little towns there around. There were petrol stations, competing petrol stations. Now, that is almost a force of economics, I won't say nature. You cannot actually stand in the way of economies of scale, let me put it like that. But I think there needs to be provision for places that don't have competitive advantage, simply because there are people who live there. Their culture is there, their lives are there, their social benefits are there. They don't want to move to town, and they shouldn't be forced to. And it's much cheaper to support people where they are. And this was not appreciated in 1994. There were big projects, and everybody must move to the big city, corridors and what have you. So, for example, in the area around East London, there are a lot of pineapple farms, and our pineapples cannot compete globally with sweeter and cheaper pineapples from Kenya and Thailand. So our pineapple canneries closed down. Now, what would it have taken to subsidize those pineapple canneries just a little bit? And one could, but because I was being told in the Trade and Industries Committee, this is not the way things were done. France, Italy, Portugal are among the most protectionist countries in the world, particularly of their agriculture. So I don't think places like, I think, southern Wales and the northeast of England, they all got subsidies from the European Union. But we had this mindset that everything that was done, other than the operation of the free market, was throwing money away and wasting money. And really, it's not like that. And I know Andrew was also at some point in the Transkei homeland. In the homeland, all the smaller towns were perishing under the dead weight of the city of Umtata. There were no pharmacies. There were no phones. There were nothing. You must see these towns now. These towns are flourishing, and they are drawing on the children of the town, that they call it plowback. So, for example, in the district of Kalanga, the children of Kalanga that have made it big, and there are many of them in China running the country, and they're actually plowing back into the home areas. They are investing in the home areas. And they're not investing in the sense of bringing in big capital and so on. They are insurance agents, they are running franchise operations, and these towns are flourishing because people don't have the money to travel to the big city. They want it where they live. So without having, without denying the forces that are called globalization, I think we need to have an open mind. I think we ought to look not only at the migration from the rural areas to the city, but at the art migration. People who have made money, have done well, and who come from the Kalas and the Tamankulus of this world, and they want their children to grow up in a crime-free environment, which apart from stock theft is still there. So I think that if we can, so I think if we can somehow stop thinking in these silos and take advantage of the data that is now available. I mean, I'm very much aware that I'm less of a Democrat than I used to be, but we have got these. That was a joke, by the way, Chairperson. Don't quote me on that one. But I think there is now the kind of information that's available through our Statistician General and others that we can actually start to look at these things objectively and to say, you cannot, there's a case now I read in the newspaper about the small town of Ashton in the Western Cape that is dying because the only factory is closing. Is it not possible to subsidize that factory, uneconomic as it might be, changing the ownership, changing the way that state-owned enterprises operate? So I would say that fix the gaps in the system, have a coherent system. Don't be afraid of being a little bit top-down. You cannot expect a rural person that does not eat 3 meals a day to develop a nuclear power plant. And you must take advantage of the democratization that has happened to actually use the data which you now have at your disposal to open the horizons. Don't just go and put a project in a place. I'm not saying that. But to actually have something, instead of coming with your yellow and green flashcards, say, this is what we have in mind, this is what we think can work, and this is our option B. Put choices in front of people. Don't say, yesterday you were starving, tomorrow you're going to be an entrepreneur. It's not going to work like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peires. We have had a wonderful contribution, one which King Cyrus, the Great, would say, diversity in council, unity in command. It looks like one of the biggest causes of failure here was the absence of unity in command. There was just too much diversity. And we have seen this diversity since 2009. Diversity in council, never coming up with an agreeable program of action going forward. Even now, there's still just too much noise in our democracy. No unity in command, diversity in council all the time. I don't think that's understanding and implementing democracy. But we have also understood that the neoliberal program that we, in many parts, we followed has actually failed, and in many ways failed us. We have also understood that the complexity that we actually injected into the system has been so huge that we ended up not knowing what we are doing from left to right. And when all the other complexities that arose from the rest of the world came, they found us at our weakest, least not about the corruption that visited us, but even if there were no corruption, we were poised for a very difficult time because of the complexities that we wrought onto ourselves. Now, the next section that we are moving to having stolen some 3 minutes from this next session, is what is called presidentialism. And we are moving from identifying the challenges to thinking about models that could assist us. Presidentialism has been put on the agenda by the Zondo Commission as the struggle for the top spot. If we were the bees, we'll be saying, who occupies the space of the queen? And everybody else will be fighting for that spot. But in the bee society, they know who the queen will be. And there's no struggle around that. They congregate around the queen. So where are we heading to? Are we going to follow Cyrus the Great in his maxim of diversity in council, unity in command? Thank you very much for this. Let me thank my presenters, Dr. Andrew Donaldson, Professor Gumede, and Mr. Peires, and our organizer of the session, Mr. Led. Thank you very much, and I wish you well going forward.